Hi, everyone. My name is Hughes, and I've been organizing a series of conversations called Looking for America. We've literally been traveling around the country into different communities and organizing from across the political spectrum to think about the question, what does it mean to be American in a community? And we've had a mix of conversations from Anchorage to El Paso to Detroit, Sioux City, and we wanted to keep it going this year, but we're in a pandemic and we're not able to actually gather in person. And so Zoom has been amazing. You know, I was skeptical about using Zoom at first because I don't like kind of interaction. I find it really awkward. But I'm warming up to it, and mostly I like it because we can actually bring together from different communities, and it's been so amazing. And so I'm excited to try to figure out how to keep doing that, not substitute for in-person, but as a supplement. So here we are experimenting together. I really appreciate you all joining this conversation. And I thought you could introduce yourselves, where you're from, but also introduce yourselves by sharing a story about an object or anything that represents your connection to your community. Shelby, do you mind starting?
Sure. Hello, I'm Shelby Pierce. I live in Sioux City, Iowa, which is in the northwest side of the state, bordering South Dakota and Nebraska across the river. You may have heard of us. We have been a COVID-19 hotspot because we have packing houses that did not shut down. So, so as far as an object that connects me to this community, I have this little rock. She is me in many ways, but this was given to me by a coworker of mine many years ago in a different career. She brought this whole bowl of little rocks like this from her grandmother who had passed away, and they had found just like a huge bowl filled with rocks like this with faces painted on them. And I remember like all the rocks were of like all different shades and colors and different faces and features. And I remember feeling so excited and known that I found one that I felt like was like me. And all of my coworkers picked them out, and that's very much a huge connector for me to this community. While we're in Iowa, and I think there's a lot of stereotypes, even amongst us living here, that we're not very diverse. It's actually, as a person who is a piece of the diversity around here, it's actually like, it's remarkably diverse in that how do I say this? I went to college in Denver and was surprised when I found that people of color lived in specific neighborhoods, because our city, there are neighborhoods where you'll find more Latino families, more African American families, but it's not segmented off. And I came home from college, and then I lived in Phoenix as well after that, and I said, you know, the one good thing about Sioux City is that anybody will have anybody's babies. That's how I view Sioux City. I'm not sure that everybody else does, but that's been my experience. And this little gal here roots me to it, and I just feel so grateful for that and for the community. So I am complete.
You're from Sioux City? Were you born there?
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Garit, how about you?
Sure. My name is Garit Lawson, and I live in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I'm a native Utahn. I've lived outside the state numerous times for a while, but have been back for a while, and probably have no plans, or I have no plans at this point to leave. And I think an interesting tradition that connects me to this community is I was born a Mormon, and my parents still are, but I haven't been for a very long time, since my early 20s. And the state, as you may or may not know, was founded by the Mormons a long time ago in 1896. And they celebrate the founding of the state in July, and they call it Pioneer Day. It's a state holiday, and it's essentially a Founder's Day. and it's July 24th, and it's called Pioneer Day. And so I grew up celebrating it, as does most of the state, and it's by nature a little exclusionary, because it's really primarily based on the Mormon founding, and so I think people who move to the state who aren't part of that religion, or people who have left the religion even from the state, feel a little excluded potentially from that holiday. And so at some point, someone realized there was a nice pun in pioneer and started celebrating Pie and Beer Day. And so it's now a tradition for folks who aren't of the predominant religion to celebrate Pie and Beer Day on Pioneer Day, and it's a very tongue-in-cheek. It's not. It certainly isn't exclusionary, other than people aren't always comfortable with that. But it's a nice way to celebrate the founding of the state, take part in a celebration, yet carve out a place in the community that's a little, showing a little different colors than the tradition. So that's one way that connects me still to this community.
That's amazing. I love that so much. Well, you actually reminded me, before we go to Olivia, I forgot to mention that, because we can't gather in person, we can actually break bread together. And that's really important, is to be able to break bread. And so we're symbolically breaking bread by flavored popcorn, thanks to our friends in Sioux City, Iowa. When we were in Iowa, we partnered up with One Siouxland, and that organization actually sent these bags of popcorn, local business, to every person who's participating in these conversations as our sort of symbolic bread breaking. So anyway, it's just been really fun, and it's really good. This is my last bag, and I barely was able to save it through, for the last couple of weeks. You're enjoying it.
Yeah, I forgot to check. I've been out of town, so just got back late, and I didn't even dawn on me that I should have checked my mail for the popcorn today.
Oh yeah, well, it's in there and it's good. Olivia, how about you? Will you introduce yourself?
Yes. So my name is Olivia Hernandez. I am from El Paso, Texas, native El Pasoan. We are a predominantly Hispanic community. It's funny because we are, I don't know how familiar you are with Texas, but we are at the very tip, the west part of Texas, with New Mexico and the country of Mexico. So we always joke that, and we're the only major city that is in the mountain time zone versus the central time zone, which is the rest of Texas. So we always joke that we are 1 hour and 10 years behind Austin. I'm better, but it's always a joke. And then the other thing is, when people move to El Paso, they think, oh, I'm going to Texas. We're like, no, you're coming to El Paso. It's more like northern Chihuahua than anything else. So it's a great experience. But I found some pictures, and I hope you guys can see. No, you probably can't, but you can Google it later. So one of the big things historically that we have is when the Spaniards kind of populated this area, they built 4 missions that are still active. So they were built over 300 years ago, and they're still, the community is still active, and they're still being used. So this one is the Socorro mission. It's Socorro, if you want to look it up. And I actually was raised Catholic, and I would attend this church. And, to me, since all my neighbors and everyone I knew went to that church, it was kind of this one thing that everybody goes to a 300-year-old church. And it wasn't until I went off to college and met people from other places that they're like, what? Like, in their brain, it was really difficult for them to understand that there were things and people here way before we were a part of the United States. So there's a really neat picture of the inside. And to this date, there's been a lot of restoration done in the last couple of years, and it's still very much to the original setting. The vigas in the top, or let me go back to the picture, down, if you can see, are throughout the church, and you can, so the smell and the sound is unique. Like when you go in, I'm not Catholic anymore, but we still visit because they have an annual church. Here they call them kermeses, which is, I guess it's the same as Pioneer Day, in celebration of the foundation of the church and the community. And so every year we do go, and it's, the smells just take me back to when I was in elementary school, middle school, and it's like no other place. And again, I grew up in that, but when you take people, I have one of my best friends from college is from Ohio. And one of the times that she came to visit, we toured the different missions, and it was so mind-boggling to her and her husband. Like, they were so impressed, and I was like, it's just the churches we grew up in. It's no big deal. But to them, it was very impressive. So I love having that to share when people come to visit. And, you know, there's been a lot of things that have happened, just like anywhere else in El Paso in the past year, that we, as El Pasoans, don't want to focus on that. We want to focus on the fact that we have the missions. We have this, it's called Concordia Cemetery, where John Wesley Harding is buried. So, you know, kind of focus on that, focus on our roots, focus on, and because we are primarily Hispanic, we're one huge family. Like, even if you've never met someone, I don't know, it was and you know, they make a call for, like, we're gonna surprise so and so. Hundreds of people show up. Not so much anymore because of the pandemic, but before this.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
that's. Mm-hmm.
And so when you say that the place has unique sounds and smells, you kind of pique my interest with the smells. What does it smell like?
It smells earthy because the walls are adobe, and then all wood is it's original wood, and it's not varnished like newer furniture where there's a lot of varnish, and that's what the smell is. But so it smells very earthy.
Okay, yeah, that's what I imagined. Yeah.
No mildew or anything like that.
I will emphasize the fact that El Pasoans are so friendly and welcoming. I was down there my birthday weekend, and one person who I just met took me and my boyfriend came with me over to Juarez for my birthday dinner, and like we just met, and we were doing that, and then later a bunch of people showed up at this bar and hung out. I just met all these people. It was awesome.
That's cool.
Paso.
Yeah. So thank you. I really appreciated my time and all of it. Anyway, okay. So one of the things that, I started this whole dinner series thing just as a thing around the 2016 election. I started inviting people to my house for dinner, people who voted oppositely than me in the election. And so I've been doing this for over 3 years. And one of the things that people often ask me, like, what have you learned? I'm like, I've learned so many things. One of the things I've learned is that, these labels that we give each other, that we have for ourselves, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, they don't really mean much to me anymore. It's just, they're too confining for me. And I get at how nuanced we are as humans, but also in our beliefs. And so even though what I tried to do was get kind of somewhat of a mixture of political views along the spectrum, there's one person missing who had to bail out right at the last second. So I'm bummed that we're not going to get her perspective. But I don't really want to focus necessarily on what you believe in terms, what your label is. But I thought it might be interesting to just think a little bit about that you hold might be surprising to somebody who knows your label. Or who, do you know what I mean? Like, if you're a conservative, what would be a surprising view to a liberal person, or to somebody? I mean, and I'll just kick it off and just an example from myself. You know, I think I'm a pretty liberal person, but it's really, I have a very hard time wrapping my head around pro-choice, the pro-choice movement. I am pro-choice, but I have a hard time bringing it all the way to the ultimate, you know, pro-choice, right to the very end. And so that I really worked. I'm still working on that, and sometimes I feel like a bad feminist, or I'm even called a bad feminist by people on my side, and I don't pass that purity test. And so that's anyway. So that's an example from me. I don't want to talk about abortion today. I just wanted to give that as an example. So anyway, how about Shelby? Do you mind kicking off what you think?
Sure. So when I was thinking about this question, I was actually just discussing it with my husband today. We were walking, and it's funny that you said that, Philippa, because I was like, I feel like I should bring up abortion. And he was like, oh, I wouldn't do that. And I was like, no, like that's the point. But we talked through it more, and I still couldn't just wrap my head around it. So I'm glad that you did.
Great. I'm glad I kicked that off.
Because what I landed on is that when I think of who my opposite might be, I would think of very conservative Republicans. And what they might be surprised to know about me is that I do not identify as a Democrat, and I don't identify as a Democrat. I feel like I constantly live in a limbo of pulling beliefs and think. I really try my best to think independently about each thing, and it turns out that many of the conclusions I've come to lean that way, but I still have such deep frustrations and feeling like lack of personal representation from really any political party, and I kind of marvel at the ability to safely identify inside of a political party and have forward movement. So that's what I believe somebody may be surprised to know about me.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, should I pass it to someone?
Why don't you pass it?
Okay, Olivia?
Sure. And oddly enough, we had this conversation with a coworker yesterday, just conversations we've had, things he's shared about himself. I knew he was, at the other end, I guess would be just conservative Republican as well, as the opposite of me. But we had a conversation regarding gun ownership, not gun control, but just gun ownership. And he said, you probably just don't agree with me. I go, no, I think if you choose to own a gun, I think there should be some measures for safety. I said, I don't own one, and mainly because I grew up with guns in my home, in my parents' home. I go, but I don't own one, because I don't feel I have the training for it. So I think there should be some responsibility with owning guns. It shouldn't just be, and it's weird because I always feel like I'm kind of in the middle, because either you're for guns and everybody, you have an arsenal set up, or you have none. I have none only because I've been focusing on other things, so I haven't had the chance for training. And if I had the training and then the training for my kids, for them to manage or hold and use firearms safely, then I would have it in my home. But it's not because I'm totally against it. It's just, but I do, do think there are, especially like AR-15s and things like that. There's really, if you're a hunter and stuff, I don't understand why you would need that. But I mean, I really have, because those are conversations that are hard to have. One, because it immediately becomes a all or nothing. And so you can't have calm, logical explanations. And then I tend to, so where I work, I'm director of rehab services. So rehab services are like, this big. Nursing is this big. And so in a lot of meetings, I ask questions like, well, help me understand. So they always take it as a challenge. And so it always seems like I'm always having to defend. And so after a while, you just get tired. And so I do start 99% of my questions with, I'm not challenging, I'm just trying to understand. But that's a work environment where there's that respect and, okay, I understand why you're asking, you're not a nurse or you don't have the background, versus with people in general, especially coworkers outside of like those formal meetings, when you ask a question, it's immediate attack, it's immediate, this is why we can't. But oddly enough, yesterday we had that conversation about guns, and it was very civil, but it was just this one rare opportunity for us to have that conversation.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Thank
So
you.
I guess, Gary, you're up.
Yeah, I think I relate to what Shelby said a bit, and that I'm very uncomfortable with trying to find, position myself within the two predominant political parties. I think that if you knew me, you would say that I'm progressive on many issues. My career is in the financial services industry, and so I work with entrepreneurs and people who own and have built businesses, and then when they're ready to sell them, I help them sell them. And so I'm probably more conservative as it relates to financial kinds of things than other progressives are. But I think if you knew me and you knew how I tend to vote, which is generally independent but more progressive, but my career is generally, most of the people I'm around are conservative. One of my beliefs is that capitalism is a very flawed economic model. I happen to think it's the best one that we've come up with, particularly for a large country. But I think it's deeply flawed and is very exclusionary. And if I started pointing out how I think the system is flawed, most of my clients and colleagues would close the door on me, and I'd be looking for work. But so I think that's one thing. If you knew me, you'd probably, while you could certainly get me to defend it, I'm also very happy to point out its shortcomings.
It's funny you should bring that up. I mean, I'm just going to pull that thread a little bit, because I love capitalism. And that is also maybe I'm not as democratic liberally as I think I am. I love capitalism, but I don't like what's happening right now. Like, what's happening right now is not real capitalism. It does hurt people. But when it functions properly,
yeah.
It's awesome. We all have these amazing opportunities. I love that.
Yeah, I agree. It very rarely functions properly. I think the amount of opportunity and the the ability to move from the social and economic class you were born in is fairly unique in this country versus some others. But the tendency to feel like that opportunity is the same for everyone is very flawed. That's not everyone in this country is born with the same opportunity to have that mobility, and so you tend to have unequal opportunity. There's lots of opportunity. It's still very unequal, and everyone would be better off if we took away some of that inequality and gave opportunities to people who are born in a situation that they're not presented with that same level of opportunity. The whole capital system would be much better off.
With you. That actually is a great way into what I thought we could talk, at least as a jumping off point, because it's pretty hard to ignore current events right now, or ever. Now in particular, it feels more important than ever to think about, this unrest, chaos that's happening right now that is sparked by this horrific act. Just happened to be caught on video, and nobody would have thought twice about it if it hadn't been caught on video and had been like truly exposed to us. What happened as clear proof that this kind of brutality exists, specifically against Black men. And so I thought I'd start with, and we can take it direction, but I've always thought of myself as a non-racist person, and kind of acted accordingly. And a couple years ago, I started hearing anti-racist, which I hadn't heard much about that before, and looked into it a little bit, but it was all sort of this intellectual thought process thing over here. And that video really brought that home to me, what that word means. And so I've really been exploring that concept a lot, about how do we become anti-racist against a system. And I think that's why I thought about it in capitalism. Like, what are the systems? It's not about individuals and whether they're racist or not. It's about the systems that create situations that make that kind of murder possible. Have you all heard of this term, anti-racist?
Yeah, I had the opportunity to see him speak at the University of Utah, Kate. Time speaking, it was phenomenal.
Yeah. Yeah, he teaches here in DC actually, so he's often around here. Anyway, so I've been thinking about systems and how we deal with systems, because something that you both said too is, I think we all feel this, is like we're constantly attacked for our, personally, but like we should be thinking about systemic things. It's particularly in terms of recent events. Oh, okay, so here's the question. I'm sorry. So I was thinking about, like, specifically about how our president decided to call out the military and throw our federal forces against the looting and all the stuff that's happening. But I think, I was reminded today, I was looking at some statistics that said that, reminded me that 108,000 people have died in the last months from the pandemic, from COVID. And when he had an opportunity to call out federal forces, he was like, "You government are on your own." So that's my view of it. It didn't affect him. It didn't seem to affect him personally. When is federal intervention acceptable and when is it not acceptable? And where do we have these separation of powers? Where are those lines, and what do you feel comfortable with?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a good question, and I certainly can't find a bright line that I would land on one way or the other there. I do think it's interesting how it allowed our president, that when the protests, some of the protests turned violent, it allowed him to change his conversation from bring in the FBI and really investigate how this event happened and how it's going to be handled to, the governors are going to be jerks and we can bring in the military. How he was able to shift the conversation from something that potentially much of his base would not be very interested in, which is really understanding how the police acted the way they did and making sure they're held accountable to see protests are violent and the states can't handle it. And so now he gets to firmly avoid one conversation because he can focus on the violence, a theme that is more what I want to say, acceptable and that occurs in a more conservative white base of the electorate.
Yeah.
So, Philippa, my mind is going to a lot of different places. So, one point which again, maybe we will circle back on if we get around to talking about capitalism, but it's becoming a common thread through all that we're talking about for me, is that when we talk about capitalism, actually give some context. I work at an investment advisory firm, and I'm not an advisor myself. However, I've learned lots of things and probably am more on a financially conservative side of things. But Garrett, I really identified with what you said. I'm like, yeah, I'm very progressive, but I also really believe in financial responsibility. Like, it's very important, and I think empowering people to not be in debt, things like that. So what was coming up for me about the very basic idea of capitalism, and is it a system that works? One thing that I really struggle to reconcile in our country and our version of capitalism is how many people have to be stood on top of in order for people to be really successful, and how, like, in its most basic form of, like, if there's demand, then supply it and you'll do really well. Like, and then once you start breaking that out and having employees and what that means and what proper distribution of that wealth really is, it gets so complicated. And it I constantly come back to, I don't know that we've ever done capitalism fairly in this country. When I think about slavery, which is this is the base of all of this, I don't feel like we look it full in the face and take responsibility for what it is. And I don't think the majority of us know really how to, especially on a nationwide level. How do we address this really basic foundation that existed in our country? And there's an entire people group that exists in this country out of it, and continually, statistically, we all know, get treated differently. It's there, and it's like an elephant in the room all the time. When I think about the lines of power, and as far as our president and what our president's role and responsibility is in all of this, it runs through that as well. Because for me personally, I try not to oversimplify things, but one thing that I have been oversimplifying in these times is the possibility of Donald Trump being our president. Like, the world that we live in, where he is what this country needs. And I say the needs part because, for me, the story in my head, which I don't believe is completely accurate, but it is what I go back to me, when I think about how the pendulum swings, right? I'm like, what was it that was so incredibly extreme about our previous president that the opposite reaction would be Donald Trump? And when I think about the person of who Barack Obama is, and I can only do that through my own lens, I think about that he was one of the most moderate Democrats in history, like, just on paper, as far as being bipartisan, as far as being willing to work through things, being articulate, like, very moderate, middle of the road. And then my next thought is, so what made him so extreme? He was Black. And I'm like, and the idea, you see the argumentation, it gets me very bound up, because I'm like, that's the response? Donald Trump is the response to having a Black man in office? Like, come on. Like, it's such an extreme response. And I find myself having these, the personhood of Donald Trump, I find him to be very divisive for me personally. Like, I feel like connecting with other people, no matter who they are and what they believe, is like such a fundamentally important thing in life. Like, it's what makes life good. Our ability to see one another, know one another, be curious, learn. And that response that exists in the president that we have right now it's startling to me, because the messaging that I've attached to it now is like, because we have a Black president. And I don't really know what to do with that, but there's some of my thoughts, you guys.
And I just want to clarify that I acknowledge everything you say about capitalism and being built on the back, the origin of slavery, and we are here today because of that. You know, I think too much about it in this sort of academic-y way, and the reality is much different.
I want to believe capitalism's that way. I want to believe like, yeah, just be competitive and a free market. But the
capitalism of it appeals to me.
When you introduce power, when you introduce all those other institutions that you're talking about, it really muddies up the water.
Absolutely.
So for me, this whole change or this whole reaction to what has happened, it was just kind of like the tipping point. You know, we as a nation, or as a planet, actually, we're all going through this mourning of a sudden change in what we were used to. We were used to be able to just get up and go, literally, just get up and go wherever we wanted. Mm-hmm. Then all of a sudden that was taken from us. But I think this is where, like, you know, you talk about capitalism and all that, where we really fell apart. So because of the position I'm in the hospital, I've had to go through emergency management training through FEMA. And it's a very structured program. It's really long. And it's like, this is what you need to do, blah, 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 this and that. And so when this happened, part of me was expecting that. Okay, you know, we're going to get guidance from the governor to this is what we're going to do, or from, you know, the White House. And none of that happened. So that at the, you know, the local, at my very personal level, that's what happens. Like, and then at the state level, we have the governor kind of taking his time, not quite deciding, but leaving it up to the mayors. So then San Antonio does one thing, and then Austin starts doing one thing, and then El Paso. And of course, us being so geographically, we were kind of at the end of things and not quite getting, so there's all this, and then from the media, there's all this misinformation about how you contract the virus, how bad it can be, how, you know, so we were dealing with all of that, all of this pent-up confusion, pent-up anger, pent-up grief. That was the big one, is we were all grieving the loss of our norm. And then we have these videos popping up. And I think that was kind of like the tipping point for many people, many communities, of enough is enough. We got to move on. And then now all of a sudden he's going to be presidential and bring out, you know, bring all the resources and everything he has at his disposal, when medical facilities and governors and other people were asking for him to act presidential. So, you know what I mean? So it was these two big things that really just made it all. I mean, there's always been tensions, and, you know, I know we started with a anti-racist. What does that mean? But we're all going to be biased. I don't know anyone, even if I like to think I'm a very open-minded person, but I also feel my views are right. Not necessarily that I can't see other people's side, but, you know, we're all going to be biased of what we personally feel is important. So if you feel money is important, that's where your bias is going to be. If you feel your, you know, family is important, that's where your bias is going to be. And so these things that we don't acknowledge, because it's, you know, no one, especially if you say, well, money's important to me, that's my goal is, especially when you work in healthcare, because your goal is supposed to be take care of everybody, heal everybody. Yeah, whatever. No, I'm just kidding. No, it is. But, you know, so those things. So anti-racist is, I think, conceptually a good idea, but the practicality of it is, it's a myth. It's a unicorn, if you will.
I think that's right. And to Philippa's point, and the whole argument of that is that racism is built into the system, unfortunately. And so, yeah, it's capitalism is great. You know, have an idea, get some access to capital, change the world, build a better mousetrap, you can become wealthy. And that's everybody likes that in this country. It's a great dream. The problem is that if a black woman has the same idea as a Harvard educated white dude, and he walks up and he and she walk up to a capital provider at the same time, it's very unlikely that they're going to choose the idea of the black woman over the white dude, because they're all white dudes and they're all Harvard educated. And so they bring their own personal biases, whether they're conscious of them or not, and they look at those two proposals and they're almost always going to go with the one that looks the most familiar to them. And so despite, what you could ask them, do you have this personal bias against black women and their ideas for businesses? They're each going to say likely no, because they're, first of all, well educated, so they've been taught not to believe that way. But they're gonna naturally go with the person that looks like them and has a similar kind of story. And so while it's a great idea, when it gets executed, it's very difficult for people who don't, for women, for minorities, anyone who doesn't look like the people who have, generated the capital historically, because, they built it on the backs of slaves and women and all of that. It's hard to bust out of that
Garrett,
system.
They were good delegators. Go on.
Very good delegators. Yeah. Yeah. And if you have a whip, that makes you even better delegator.
You're an excellent delegator.
Motivator. But it's so true, because so where I work, we wear a uniform pretty much all the time as the therapist. And then when I became director, I continued wearing the uniform stuff, but we were going to an important meeting, I can't remember, off campus, so I decided to dress up that day. People I had worked with for years, people I've been in the elevator with for years, all of a sudden were like, hey, good morning, and people talk to me differently. So all of a sudden I'm like, oh my gosh, this, I have to dress up every day now. And, because of the pandemic, we're back to dressing down. But that was the first, I was conscious and aware of all this, but you always think, especially in El Paso, I am the majority. I am a Hispanic person. But then once that little change happened, you're like, oh, I'm not, because the mentality is a white man will get it done versus somebody else. They'll get it done eventually.
Yeah. Yeah, very true.
So yeah, it was eye-opening, to say the least.
Yeah.
I keep wondering about Garrett, what you were talking about, like the difference between walking into a bank and asking for a loan. It reminded me of actually the shooting of Michael Brown. When Michael Brown was shot, one of my immediate responses was I said to whoever I was with, I don't remember who I was with at the time, but I said, if the police officers in those situations had lived in that neighborhood, it may not have happened. Yeah. And I have a former coworker that I have that grew up in a small town outside of the city. I get that we're like small, but we're like the big city around here at 98,000. But we have like small towns. Like less than like 100 people towns. And in one of those towns, one of my coworkers was from there, and she was talking about how when they would go out and party in the fields, like cornfields, and when they were in high school, underage, get really smashed drunk, like drinking to the point where it was dangerous, that she remembers her sheriff giving her a ride home, that he was like, you all need to be safe and get home alive. And for me, that story was like, I was like, oh, Stephanie, I wish that was our reality with our police. Like, if our uncles were like that innate desire that we have to relate to one another and to have family and to see one another as each other, and how important and powerful that is. And how do we, instead of saying, don't do that, how do we pivot that into a more equal system of representation at all levels? Like, if you just make more diversity happen where more people can relate to their people, whatever that looks like, I feel like we could get so much. That's my desire, is I want to like get further that way. Like, I want to stop like working against our natural instincts. Like, yeah, we get it. Of course you trust someone that looks like you that went to college.
And then unfortunately the whole system suffers because we only get one point of view. We only get one solution.
So
we're missing out on this whole range of possibilities, this whole range of solutions to so many different problems, whether they're economic or not. The whole world misses out on it because we don't, not everybody's voice gets prized in the same way.
I mean, again, I'm an idealistic person. I mean, the idealist in me thinks about, in your example, Garrett, this idea that, well, you asked that white guy if he was this, whatever, of course he knows the right answer to that. But he might actually inside know he's a little racist, but he can't say that. We can't even allow that conversation to happen. To me, that is part of the problem, is that we can't even have an honest conversation in the first place. So how can we even address that problem? And the other twist I was going to give on that example is, I think a better example would be, you could have a Harvard educated Black woman, average white guy with money. Definitely going to get the money before the Harvard educated Black lady.
Yeah, that is a better example.
And I was thinking about that, that Central Park incident with the birder, and everybody was like, oh, can you believe it? He was like, he went to Harvard and he like, and I'm like, yeah, exactly. That didn't protect him when danger started.
I'm so thankful he taped that. When I listened to it, like,
it was actually kind
I'm sorry. I can laugh because something bad didn't happen from it. Well, I mean, she did lose her job, sorry.
Yeah.
But
it was so absurd. Like,
and to think that had he not taped it, that it's a totally different, it's the likelihood that it was a totally different outcome.
Yeah.
That's also another good example. Like, she's a liberal person, and she like donated to all the Democrats. So you see, this is the problem. Like, those labels don't mean anything. And we can't even talk about it.
Philippa, I think it's really one of the dangers that happens it's fun. It's very exciting to own a label and be inside of the club and be a part of the us group. Like, that's a really neat thing to do. And I think that in Christianity, people experience, not just Christianity, faith in general, these things that bond us together, but it's all about balance, right? And when that takes us out of having access to those that are different than us, that think differently than us, and I don't think that liberalism is immune to that. Like, a lot of times when I look at it, I'm like, well, you're throwing money into nonprofits that you don't even know what it's doing just because you're satisfying your conscience. Like, what are the ways that we're buying our way out of actually knowing other people, like genuinely knowing or confronting what's scary to us?
Well, and knowing yourself. I mean,
knowing
others, but also like you were saying, Shelby, like, look inside and make your own choices.
Yeah.
There's a couple, I've been reading a lot. One remind me of a couple things, but this idea of in-group and out-group. I mean, it is important for humans to have an in-group, that's how we survive. Even today, that's how we survive, emotionally and whatever. So, but to your point, balance. You can't hurt others who are in your group. But there's this great book called Winners Take All. Have you all read that, or have you seen it? It's so interesting. It gets to your point. It's about like how philanthropists burnish themselves basically by giving money solve problems in the world, to solve problems that they helped cause. But
That's
like
awesome.
giving themselves a pat on the back, they
Right.
haven't really solved anything, and whatever they're giving, barely their wealth at all. I really recommend it. It's so good.
Mhm.
That's good to know.
Just well, what you were saying made me think a lot about made me think about tribalism, and so like I think I do hold the belief that like the only thing that I can control is myself, right? And like starting with myself is important, and to seek self-awareness. And if I'm putting a judgment onto someone else, like I need to examine that in my own, like I need to examine it in my own life, having those things. So you start with yourself, right? And then that expands to another group of people that you know, a tribe perhaps, but then that expands to a whole community, then that expands to a state, to a country, to a world, right? And when I think about the Native Americans, my tribe is the Santee Sioux, and like the like if we could go back and rewrite history, right, and like pull them all aside and be like, look, here's the thing, there's a group that's coming that sees you all as the same. So if you could function as all the same, you're gonna have a better outcome. But we know you're different. You're different. And this is like that push-pull we're constantly going through as human beings, and then like even whole cultures. Like that's honestly one of the things I think is genius about white Western civilization, their ability to be like, yeah, we're the ones in power, get out. Like, they just like even though they came from different countries with very different cultures, very different backgrounds, that ability to cling together and then dominate, I don't want to say that I actually admire it. I just understand how that shook out to be on top. And
It's interesting. I've never really thought about it, but I think that's right. That somehow they coalesced when everybody else didn't. And just the numbers alone.
yeah.
Philip, I'm not sure how much time we have. I have a meeting that's starting now, so I'm going to have to jump off. I apologize if I'm leaving early.
Okay. We're having such an interesting conversation that I was like, will you take my poll real quick before you jump off?
Yeah, I will. Yeah.
I have to, it's the second.
And Shelby, Olivia, it was very nice to meet you and talk with you. I enjoyed the conversation very much.
Nice to meet you too, Garrett.
Thank you. Great meeting everyone.
Yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah, it's frustrating. This always happens. We're like really getting into the interesting part of this, and then
You need to start having weekend Zoom retreats, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really actually thinking about something like that. So I'd love your feedback on.
Yeah, for sure.
Great.
Yeah. So okay, thank you, Garrett.
Thank you. Bye.
So nice to meet you.
Yeah, take care.